Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a Triad production. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon. I'm very excited about today's episode because this will be part of our Clinicians Series episodes, where we will get to take our listeners beyond the proverbial therapeutic door. I'm very excited to also have a returning guest, Christina Rasmussen. Christina Rasmussen is a renowned grief educator and best-selling author, known for her impactful books, Second First, Where Did You Go, and Invisible Loss. Following the loss of her spouse to cancer in 2010, Christina developed the Life Reentry process, dedicated to bringing compassion and validation to countless individuals navigating grief. Holding a master's degree in guidance and counseling from the University of Durham, she is also pursuing a Master of Fine Arts degree in painting and drawing at the Academy of Art. Christina's work has been featured in prominent outlets such as ABC News, Women's World, The Washington Post, and the White House blog. And she is also a contributor to Psychology Today. We're thrilled to welcome Christina back today as we explore the concept of invisible loss and discuss effective strategies and frameworks for navigating grief. Thank you so much for coming back with us, Christina. Welcome to the show.
It's so good to be here. And by the way, I feel like I'm just hanging out with two friends I've already met before. So it really feels great. So thank you for having me back.
Awesome. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, can you briefly remind our listeners about the concept of invisible losses and why these types of losses are significant and maybe even different than we've understood loss before?
Is it okay if I start a little bit historical from my own discovery? And that will help the listener also understand the journey to how we get to discovering invisible loss for
Yes,
themselves, for their
please
own
do.
practice. My initial training, I have a master's in counseling psychology, guidance and counseling, to be very specific, from England, from Durham University. And I did my thesis on the stages of bereavement. And I had the word obsession comes, but love, I want to say love for understanding how, as professionals, we can help people find their way back to living again after they experienced the devastating loss of a loved one. I really felt like that must be the most devastating thing that could happen to a human being. And it is, and it was. And what I didn't know then was that just a few years later, my first husband passed away really young from stage 4 colon cancer. And as destiny would have it, I had to experience tragic grief from the other side, from that personal side. And the huge revelation at the time was that I was not prepared for anything. Not that if you're a heart surgeon, you should be able to do heart surgery on yourself. The same way as a professional, we can't take care of ourselves the way we take care of our clients and so on. But I realized there was a gap between what I was experiencing and what I was taught at the time. So I made a promise to myself that if I was ever to recover, heal, come back to myself, I would find a way to go and help others again, because I couldn't possibly do the work that I was doing before while I was recovering myself. So about 4 years went by and I resigned from the corporate world and went back and started doing this work and created a methodology that I call the Life Reentry model, which, by the way, also has just completed 2 major clinical trials. That all the data and all the analysis of that data is really being done by the scientists right now. And there will be 2 scientific papers being released, I'm hoping, by the end of 2024, which is
Wow.
very exciting. I can't say more than that. But this work has been tested and tried specifically on invisible loss, even though it didn't start out like that, for caregivers, specifically on caregivers. One trial was caregivers with spouses who had severe spinal cord injuries. And the other trial was for caregivers with spouses who had traumatic brain injuries.
Oh, wow.
So I immersed myself with this group of scientists for about 5 years, a long time, from the beginning, before they got the funding to do this, to all the way to now stepping into, you know, side by side. Hopefully, I get to experience that part too, where the analysis of the data. But this journey with this work has taken place the last 14 years. Outside of the clinical trials, I've spent the last 14 years running life reentry classes for people from all over the world. The classes occupied around 100, 150 people in each class. And I made this discovery. And this is when I made this discovery. As I was working with people who had experienced tragedies and loss of children, loss of spouses, more traditional, even divorce and losses that we have already accepted as grief and trauma, I started seeing something that was quite surprising. I started seeing people recover for a little bit, experience a healthy recovery, but then something would pull them back in what I call the waiting room, the place between the life we stopped living because of what happened to us and the life that we could have. They would go back to that place in between and they would get stuck there. And of course, the easiest thing would have been to say it must be grief, the grief from the tragedy, the grief from that big loss, because we are told and we studied and researched that grief lasts forever, it never ends. But it wasn't that. And I'm so glad that I was brave enough to come across a little outside of the box and kind of consider that the possibility of what was pulling them back was something else that we couldn't quite articulate, label, or see, and what invisible loss is. And that's why I called it invisible, because it was very subtle, almost like phantom. It was there, but it had no words. And what I started seeing was that there were moments of, I call them moments of impact, that happen in everyone's life at some point. And those moments of impact are not traditionally seen as a trauma, as a loss, even small traumas and big traumas and small T, big T, all that stuff that we know, all that training everyone has done. These moments of impact were lost in translation. They were lost in everyday life. And because of those moments, and I will give examples as well, we had to survive those moments, but we stayed in survival mode beyond that moment of impact. We stayed in that waiting room, in that survival experience for years to come. And because of that, we started making decisions based on surviving, avoiding risk, avoiding more rejection or pain. And we actually started creating a life that wasn't quite the life that we would want, but the life that we felt safe having.
Mm.
When I realized that, I was both excited and scared because how do you describe something that we haven't labeled yet, that we haven't really understood really well? And the danger of it was that most people, even now, when I've had all these so many conversations for Invisible Loss, for the new book, I find people automatically go to that traditional trauma experience for themselves or for their client, but it is not that. It is a moment. For example, I'll give an example. Let's say growing up, your mother or father, when they spoke to you, they didn't look you straight in the eyes, or they favored your older sibling, or sometimes in the way that they spoke about you, they were apologetic about your skills or your gifts. They were not really proud, but it's not that they were not saying they were proud, but they seemed a little embarrassed. But you felt it, but you didn't know that's what you were feeling. You felt a little confused. There are thousands of examples of invisible losses depending on your own personal circumstance. For example, someone's mother may be a little embarrassing in the way she dresses. She doesn't look like all the other kids' moms that she just stands out a little bit, and you're embarrassed. So you start coping, you start surviving every time your mom drops you off at school. You may have an experience later in your adult life where you are in a meeting And when you speak up and say something, people don't say, oh, that's great, I agree. They just kind of go quiet. That's a moment of impact, right? And you feel it. We feel it. We feel that moment. And because of those experiences, we actually redirect our life. Our next choices, our road ahead may not look the same as it would have looked. Those experiences will always impact us. But if we stay in that mode of survival, we actually making decisions based on that shift of perspective of who we think we are. We actually lose what invisible loss is the loss of what I call the original self. And I don't say authentic, even though that's not wrong. I don't say true self, I say original, because we came into this world in a specific way. And because we haven't stepped in the shoes of that original self for too long, because we had to abandon that part of us and kind of become a little different to allow for that survival, we actually stopped evolving that original sense of self that we came here to be. So the work that I do, and in this book, I try to help people go back, track those invisible losses. And it's not easy. It's almost like the book is a map, and find those moments that one at a time, one moment at a time, that impacted them, that shifted that perception of who they think they are. And we then slowly help them re-enter their life and being more connected to that original self than they've been. And once we reconnect them, they then start evolving that. We raise ourselves, like we evolve that original self. And we allow for that to be present in our life, and for that part of us to make decisions for what we want to have, for the kind of relationships we want. Okay, and one more thing I want to say is that there are millions of people who have not experienced a tragedy, a traditional loss per se, that feel confused, they feel stuck, they have a lot of anxiety, they feel sad, depressed, and they don't know why. And this is who we're trying to help.
Yes. And honestly, you said that you were saying too much, but you really weren't. You really led me right into the next thing I wanted to discuss with you. I appreciate that you said the book, you use it as somewhat of a map, but can you give us a bit more details or any specific strategies or steps that are included in the book, or even that maybe a practitioner could use with a client that really helps to figure out how to acknowledge and identify those invisible losses? Because I don't think you can address them if you don't know what they are,
Right.
correct?
Sharlee, I have so much to say that I'm thinking to myself, I have so much to say about this. And first of all, the book, it has everything in it. And I wrote it in a way to allow for anyone who finds this book, they won't need me there. They will, I say, you can either take it to your therapist, or you can take it to a support group, or you can do it on your own. But this book has every single exercise in it. I'm going to say that first. The second thing I'm going to say is that the back of the book, if the practitioner, the therapist, the clinician, the facilitator wants to take their client through this process step by step, I created a very long guide at the back that gives specific weekly instructions on how to do exactly that. And if those two things are not enough, I'm going to share with you the very first things that someone needs to do when they start their journey with their client. It could be a client you worked with for a long time, and suddenly you came across this work and say, you know what, let's see, maybe that's what's going to allow my client to move forward. They feel stuck. So let's say you worked with someone for a really long time and you want to introduce this work to them. You start sharing about this, explaining what invisible loss is very quickly, not like a lecture, not like an education, but more like, how does this land with you when I say the word invisible loss? When I say that word to you, what comes to you? And then the client will respond and say, you know, whatever they say, whatever their response is, whether it's right or wrong, meaning whether it's what they're describing is an invisible loss or a loss that's not invisible, you always have to say they were right about this, because if wherever the client is, whatever in that journey that client is, we need to be there with them instead of taking them to, no, that's not what I'm asking you to, to say. I'm asking you for something else, for something like this. So we will get there. But the very first thing is that whatever comes to them, to acknowledge that, whatever that experience they shared, to listen and to help them receive that first moment of validation for whatever that was. And that's very basic and very kind of informal to begin with. And then ask the client if they would like to dig deeper to see if there is anything else. And then the client would ask, like, what? Then you can start explaining a little more about what this is. Another thing that I always ask people to do to begin with is to write their story of origin as it stands right now, without any explanation of what invisible loss is, of what I call the three narrators that live inside of us: the survivor self, the thriver self, the watcher self. We'll talk about that later. Without explaining anything, we want kind of a starting point of where that client is. So the person will start sharing about their life. And if it's a verbal share, so you're sitting at your therapist's office and it's not in writing, because a lot of these exercises in the book are writing, you want to ask your client to share their life story for about 5 minutes, no longer than that. This doesn't have to be long, from their perspective of what it's like today. And then, especially if they say things like, I was so grateful to be raised by these great parents. I, didn't have anything really go wrong in my childhood. I was actually really lucky. When they're complete with that first share of the story, then you ask them, I want you now to consider something else. I want you to say, even though I had great parents, and even though I grew up in this great place, or whatever that positive part of their stories, I also experienced this and this and this. We want to start creating an environment for our client, for their mind to travel to places that they have been hiding even for themselves, because we are raised in a world that tells us to be grateful for what we have, to not complain too much, to put our heads down, and to keep moving forward. And I'll tell you guys, even though in this work is really for the Western world, where we have, so much material goods around us, I know there's a lot of people who are poor and they're hungry, and poverty and hunger is a real problem in our world. But the work that I do here is for the next door neighbor who has the manicured lawn and and the pretty little house with the picket fence, but is suffering deeply and doesn't want to be alive inside. We are here to save those. That's my narrow lenses of this work. And there's thousands of books and thousands of organizations that help the visible losses world, where we know when someone is suffering from something, and it's easy for us to know what it is they need. They need food, they need money, they need opportunity, they need mentorship. We know those things, what they are. But as a practitioner, as a clinician, as a therapist, as a facilitator, your responsibility is to look for the things, to help your client find the things they've never considered as a loss, and they never allowed themselves to be honest about what happened, how they really felt when their spouse spoke to them in a specific way in front of their friends, when their boss did something that wasn't so bad, but it wasn't great, but you can't share it with anyone. How did that make them feel? So it's important to guide as you're stepping into that life reentry work. It's important to allow for extreme validation and extreme acknowledgement for every moment we feel ashamed to even share, because we should be so lucky to have all the things that a lot of people don't have.
We'll be right back after word from our sponsor.
Most of us spend more time at work than anywhere else doing anything else. So why not spend that time in a job you love? Introducing Triad's Jobs Marketplace, the only job site dedicated specifically to behavioral and mental health professionals. Featuring more than 1,000 open jobs from dozens of behavioral and mental health employers, and searchable by location, professional field, employment type, specialization, and more. Jobs Marketplace helps you find your next career opportunity. Full-time, part-time, or gig time, make the most of your time. To access Jobs Marketplace, register for your free professional account at hellotriad.com/BHT. That's hellotriad.com/BHT, and then click to Jobs Marketplace. If you're already a member of the Triad community, visit app.hellotriad.com/jobs. That's app.hellotriad.com/jobs. Visit us today and take your next career step tomorrow.
But honestly, as a social worker, just your person and environment and being able to meet people where they are and not pushing them to the, okay, that's great, but that's not what I meant type of theory is the approach that your book or your talks, the approach that they take is, it really does speak to me. And I think it will to other practitioners, because I'm not trying to put, or it doesn't try to put someone in the spot that you want them to be in. It allows them to take ownership of where they start and what it looks like going forward, allowing them to write and create or remember what that origin story looks like, so that they are able to pinpoint where those moments of impact happened and where the invisible losses happen, so that you can make a change for them moving forward.
And to feel
So
validated, and to feel like that someone for the first time is there to see
mhm, they see
something
them.
that they struggled with, but they couldn't even understand. We understand for themselves. Imagine having a mirror. Imagine having, and I'll tell you, in this work, you hear thousands of moments of impact that resulted into these invisible losses that are so different. And someone's moment of impact, let's say we have the same exact experience happen, a moment of impact for two people from different backgrounds. One may experience a moment of impact. The other one may say, that didn't upset me, actually. It didn't bother me at all,
Mhm.
because of very different life story, different upbringing, different. So we compare our stories. I remember over the years, especially when I was working with a lot of tragic loss, people were so competitive about their grief. They were competing, and I heard the stories of many thousands of people, and publicly they would compete. You haven't lost a child and a husband. You don't even know how this feels. And we shame people who actually may want to even take their own life, because what they're feeling is so hidden, and they're so ashamed for whatever that is. You know, and Sharlee and Peter, I want to say is that human beings are so vulnerable. We are so sensitive. We are like these beautiful flowers. Like we are, and I'm getting chills saying that, but we live in a very harsh world. Like it's a tough world out there, right? We have to go out there every day and fight for our dreams and fight for ourselves and our families to bring food that, like, it's a fight, right? Every day. And yet
Yeah.
we're these like vulnerable and sensitive beings, that we're not being treated as such. And we need to help the world and each other start behaving as if we are the most kind of sensitive beings in the whole universe. It's rare that actually there's more people with big hearts than people who don't care. Like there's more people with goodness and just being hurt every day than people who are doing harm. That they're the people that I care about. And those who do harm are most of the times are because they've been hurt themselves. They have been shamed growing up. And public rejection, by the way, public shaming is one of the most complicated forms of invisible loss. It's the
Yeah.
worst to get through. because it's public. So when you're in a meeting and your voice is not being heard, when you're in a group setting and you're being shut down, when someone is being rude to you in front of other people, it's hard to come back from those moments actually, and we don't talk about them. We don't raise them up as something significant.
Right. You're told to be able to, or expected to be able to fight through them all.
Right,
Yeah.
Charlie? Like, hey, you have your health, you have your kids are healthy, you have a home, you have a roof over your head. Be quiet. That is no longer the case in this modern world that we live in. This is not the way we can go forward, you guys. We cannot move forward like this. This is the new kind of work that we need to be doing.
So that brings me to a question then. So you mentioned that, and I've seen for myself that in the back of the book there are homework assignments for every different progressive topic.
Yes.
There are homework assignments.
Yes.
And I personally, even as a clinician, I did not make it through the first one without using a little street terminology here. I didn't make it through without feeling some type of way about all of the things, those moments of impact that I had growing up, or even, as I got older. I know journaling and self-reflection has to be a part of the process. And those prompts and exercises are there for that. But then are there certain techniques that can be used to ensure that people don't feel overwhelmed, or what do you do with that? Like, how do you manage it?
I love this question very much because there's two things that is important to remember. One is that this kind of work has to feel good for it to continue. And it's a very hard and difficult balance to create, but we have two things at play. We'll have an experience of release when the client feels validated and seen for the first time. And also, I don't want to use the word re-traumatized, but we are also grieving deeper because we're realizing, guys, actually the things you felt, it was right. You were right to feel this way. You have all these intense, like you said, Sharlee, intense feelings of like grief and like, I can't believe this really, this was real. This really was a moment of impact. This was really lost for me. This actually did change the trajectory of my life. So there's so much, you're right. There's so much intensity that is going to come from that. So the therapist, the clinician, and the facilitator will have to be able to balance a feeling of release and a feeling of grief. Okay. And as they're sitting in their office or where they're Zooming with their client, however it takes place these days, it's important to get a sense of, has my client had enough validation release to be able to experience more intensity? And then I will talk about reward as well. You need to be able to see if they're not also experiencing sighs of relief, as if imagine finally a wound is being tended to for the first time. You feel like, thank God, I have someone cleaning the wound, right? And you want to feel that safety and feeling of like, finally, this is happening. But at the same time, that may make you feel more pain, might remind you of all the things. So you have to gauge, and depending on the experience of the therapist, you have to gauge how far to take the client. If they've had an intense session, make sure that their homework going home, or the things they're going to do between the week that you see them and then the next week that you're about to see them next, is that they are having a lot of self-care, things that make them feel good. So every chapter basically takes you on this journey and allows you to create this homework that I call mental stacking. And the best advice I give to a therapist is that to take it slow. Unless the client wants to go faster, you can, but there's no rush. Actually, the longer we spend in the initial invisible loss chapters, where we are trying to figure out what type of invisible losses took place, what kind of moments of impact did we have, where we are for the first time finding the words and labels for what happened to us. And if we rush through that experience, it will always feel incomplete, and the person will always be coming back to the waiting room for long periods of time and not just short breaks. So we need to take it easy at first. Before we even go for the more complicated and complex homework, we want to allow for the person to start that healing process for themselves. If they are able to also, when they go home, to have someone to share the therapy session that they've just had with a trusted person, that's ideal, because more processing is take place of what happened, the more release we're experiencing, and the more we take a breath. It's okay, and I feel safe, and I'm so glad I'm figuring things out now. Now this makes sense. You would hear people say, wow, I didn't realize this. This is why I made the decisions I made. And again, and I'm going to say this very loud and clear, Sharlee, and you're right, this actually has a lot of loss attached to it. Even for me personally, my own invisible losses. When I realized some things about myself and why there were some things that were really hard for me when I was younger, and I'm not talking as a child, even as a young adult, when I realized why, because I started figuring out who I was as a person. I mean, I shed some tears and I said to myself, I wish I knew this about myself then. It would have been so much easier because when we have invisible losses we don't know about, our path is going to be really hard. And it gets easier when we know why we feel the way we feel and that there's something we can do about it.
Gotcha. Absolutely. And you mentioned two things, and I will break them up, but both of them I want to talk about. So both of those two things are taking a break and self-care.
Yeah.
So you mentioned briefly how a clinician can know when it's time to take a break, right after a very intense session. What does a break look like to a clinician? What happens in that break period? What type of homework goes along with a break, or is there homework there? And then how do we know when it's time to come back?
I love this conversation much, you guys. I can't say it. I know I'm not supposed to have this parenthesis in here, but you can edit it out. But I'm loving this because it's so critical. I mean, so you can create breaks even with just language inside a session. And a break doesn't have to be a break between, between this Tuesday and next Tuesday. A break,
Okay.
let's say you're seeing your client, you're seeing them go into what I call a grief trance, like kind of like you're losing them. You're losing them in the session. Bring it back to them. Ask them, how does this, whatever it is that we're talking about, how does that feel? Is it too much? Because this could be too much sometimes. And this is work you can do in the future. You don't have to do it today. Today is not the only day that we can do this. We can talk about something else and we can just make some notes and leave this right here and park it right here and it's not going to go anywhere. We're not going to lose it. I remember exactly what you said. I have everything down here. So the client feels safe that they don't have to carry what they discovered about themselves, what they realized about a relationship they have, and that the therapist is able to hold that space for them when they're ready to come back to that. So you want them to feel held, safe, and that they don't have to carry this with them all the time and alone. They can leave it with their therapist. Here it is. It's right here. And I'm actually pointing at my little open journal here. Just it's right here. We leave it right here. Now, when it comes to breaks in between sessions, you can give your client permission to, if they feel it's too much, they don't have to think about this until the next time they come here, or even 2 times from now. They don't have to share it with anyone if they're not ready. For me, this goes without saying, but you never know how people feel when they realize something about themselves, that there's nothing wrong with them and this story. It's actually a brave and incredibly beautiful thing to be able to do, is to understand who we are and why we feel the way we do, why something is really hard. For example, there's things that are hard for me but are not hard for other people, and I always felt as if I was less than others because this was hard for me. Imagine if I had someone in my life to say, all that means is that there's something in the way that you feel about this that is not right for you, and you need to go and have another experience. You need to try a different job. You need to have a different relationship, this is not right for you because of this and this and this. It's nothing, you're not doing anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. Actually, the other thing is wrong for you. This is just not right for you.
Yeah.
Because you have anxiety when you get on a train. I'm just like, and there's no reason for that. It's just that you don't like train rides. You don't need to take a train. We need to figure out another way for you to get to work, period. And there's nothing more than that. And to give us, this is a very basic example, but to give ourselves permission that life doesn't have to be this hard and we don't have to live this way. However, whatever way that is. So break in the session with language
Okay.
and break outside of the session, allowing the client, they're free to not think about it until next time, to put it away or to share with someone. Also rewards, and I want to add a third thing, and then a little bit about self-care, but every time there's an invisible loss being discovered, there has to be some kind of reward attached to that. So later in the book and in the guide in the back and the exercise of a plug-in. What is a plug-in? Plug-in is a very low risk step that we take towards the life that we want to have, towards that original self. It's safe to introduce the plug-in a little easier than when the book says, a little earlier, not easier, it is easy, a little earlier than when the book says, and introduce it as, because you've done so much work together and you've actually discovered things that you didn't know all these years. What is rewarding? What is an experience you want to have when you go back home in this next week? What will make you feel good? Completely irrelevant to the invisible loss. If they need to be, it could be a fun evening out with your spouse. It could be getting something special for yourself. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be specifically to the invisible loss. So we allow for freedom of expression, freedom in our life to take this on or put it back down. And then the final thing, I guess it's 4 things. The final thing is self-care. Throughout this whole process and this whole experience, we need to start helping our client to experience love and compassion for themselves. Actually, self-compassion, when I was doing my own little questions, when I was running all these classes, in the beginning of the class, from 0 to 10, how much self-compassion do you have for yourself? 10 being the most self-compassion, 1 being the least. So we would be able to measure that because I felt that was the one thing people were lacking when they didn't understand and they didn't realize how much actually loss they experienced in their life, because it didn't look like someone dying. It didn't look like abuse. It didn't look like the tragedy that we know about when we watch movies or when our grandparents experience something or our parents. It did not look like that. And so we don't have a lot of self-compassion because we didn't realize we were actually suffering in the way that we're being told is suffering. So when we realize actually we went through a lot and there was a lot of suffering, Sharlee and Peter, you know what happens? Our self-compassion grows. And my goodness, I can tell you, obviously I'm a nerd because I enjoyed looking at the scale of self-compassion just grow because finally you say to yourself, oh my God, poor thing. You went through so much. And imagine having this compassion for yourself. Doesn't that feel good? That's
It does.
self-worth, self-compassion, So that's what I have to say about that.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And so what are some takeaways that you want our listeners to gain from the understanding and addressing invisible losses? How can you continue the work when it becomes challenging? Tell us what you want to leave for us.
So there's these phases in the work. So your client will experience all of the phases that I talk about. There will be a phase where your client may not want to not do the work, but kind of dismiss it. I don't think so. I didn't go through anything. And kind of not reject the possibility that they've experienced something that they didn't really understand at the time. But I would say to the practitioner, to the clinician, to the therapist, don't give up in the beginning, because they may not see the value of the work immediately. It might take a little bit of time. And even though I do not suggest correction of the client when they are sharing what they think is invisible loss, keep digging deeper and deeper so your client can actually get. Because imagine, invisible loss is not just invisible to everyone else, it's invisible to us. That is the hardest thing about invisible loss. Like, we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
So we can't help ourselves. We don't know. And I worked with the best, easiest participants, but also those that definitely pushed back a lot, especially when they started changing their life and they received a negative response from their family members.
Mm.
So I call that phase a divergent phase, because you become more rebellious. You start doing things that your family members kind of are surprised and shocked, because you're changing your life. You're finally coming back to yourself. So you're starting to behave differently. And it's not, the others don't feel safe when you're all of a sudden someone else, or you're changing. So that's not going to be very rewarding at first. That's going to feel negative. So you have to keep telling your client to trust the process and to keep going down that path, re-entering and finding their way back to who they are. And even though progressively the steps will have more risk, I will also say to the practitioners to not risk too much for a long time. Meaning, I do not believe that the client should be taking massive big steps for the majority of the time. Those will happen later on. At first, they need to feel really safe to change their life. Once they figured out the invisible loss, once you went through a period of time where they now know themselves better, now they understand where they want to go next and give themselves permission to do that. Some of them say, okay, I'm going to go and quit my job. I'm going to go and break up with my girlfriend. I'm going to go leave my marriage. I would not recommend that. And I say this because that is not the way to go about it. Yes, I've seen people do it and they landed okay, but why rush this? So that's where those plugins come in, and we take it one step at a time. And I wouldn't say the word strategic, but it has to be organic. It has to feel natural, because this is a way of life. It's not just the methodology. It's the way I live my life today. The way that, I'm about to make a decision, for example, in the fall, that is definitely not just a 5% risk, or it's bigger than that. But I've made a lot of the 5% and 10%. My fear center was definitely activating more and more as time went by. I feel I'm getting ready to make a bigger leap, but it's not easy. Even for I've created this, I've lit this, I've guided thousands of people through this. This is when you're getting your life right, finally, it's going to be both really easy and really hard. And that's the duality of life reentry.
Thank you for that. So Christina, where can our listeners learn more about your book, Invisible Loss, Recognizing and Healing the Unacknowledged Heartbreak of Everyday Grief? And then where can folks learn more about you and your work?
So first of all, I always say to people, grab the book. It's like a handbook. It's more than like people writing to me right now and saying, "Oh my goodness, this is going to take me a long time." I said, yes, this is not about finishing it up. So grab the book, bring it with, put it on your desk, next to your bed, whatever it is. If you want to just jump in for a little bit to wet your feet, go to ChristinaRasmussen.com. We've had an amazing Guardian article being written about the work that it's long, but it gives you a summary of what Life Reentry is. So ChristinaRasmussen.com has the latest articles and blogs. But if there's one thing that people do after the end of a podcast, and this is only one thing to do, would be just grab the book and do the work. And if you're obviously a clinician, a therapist, I've had over the years, for all the books I've written, people write to me and say, my therapist told me about your book. My therapist told me about the book. Don't I have a great therapist? People always say, I'm like, yes, and we do the exercises together. So have the book there, do the exercises together with your client, and help them along the way with your own skills as well and your own experience your professional toolbox. Mix and match. One exercise from Life Reentry, another exercise from something else that you trained yourself in. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Use your intuition, your gut to blend in whatever you think is right for your client.
Christina, I have thoroughly enjoyed this. Second time around, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you speaking with us today.
It was amazing. And obviously, as you guys can see, I can talk for another hour easily. And you make it so easy. And thank you for caring enough to bring this subject to light and to help so many people discover their invisible losses and their original selves, and to live a life of their choosing, whatever that is, whatever that might be. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to join us. The resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.